Great to see so many people. Oh my goodness, got great support here. And I recognize you all from yesterday, so congratulations on making it to the final round. It's wonderful. We'll introduce ourselves, you introduce yourselves and your teachers, and then we'll read the question and get going. I'm John Cousins. I'm an entrepreneur and investor from New Mexico, and I'm really looking forward to another good give and take like we had yesterday.
And hi, my name is Tandy McConnell. I was a professor of history at Columbia College for about 20 years, but right now I'm teaching high school with students very much like you.
Hi, my name is Trish Everett. I was once a student like yourselves in the We the People program, and since then have taught and coached my own teams. I am now teaching government and psychology in South Florida. And would you introduce yourselves?
Certainly. Hello, we are Unit 1 from Grant High School in Portland, Oregon. I'm Jackson Snyder.
I'm George Crittenden.
I'm Caden Searcy.
I'm Owen Casey.
I'm Samantha Blacker. This is our teacher, Misty Pesquel, and thank you guys so much for being here today.
Thank you.
Well, a pleasure. And by process of elimination, you obviously know what question we're going to do. It's number 1, Unit 1. And I'll read the question now to you. John Trenchard wrote in 1721, "So that to know the jurisdiction of governors and its limits, we must have recourse to the institution of government, and ascertain those limits by the measure of power, which men in the state of nature have over themselves and one another. To what extent is a constitution a limit on government and/or a limit on the people themselves? How does the U.S. Constitution reflect this tension between limits on government and the people? What is the appropriate balance of limited government and empowered government today?"
Constitutions do not directly limit the people. As Emmerich de Mattel stated, constitutions merely determine the manner in which public authority is to be executed. They empower the government to impose limits on the people through statutes and court rulings. John Trenchard wrote that the people permit these limits for their own sake and establish such rules and maxims for their mutual preservation. To Trenchard, all men would be tyrants and do what they please if given unlimited power, leading to a continual state of wretchedness and uncertainty. Therefore, there must be limits on government power. According to the radical Whig Junius, government power is limited by the forms and principles of a constitution.
Trenchard suggests 3 fundamental ways a constitution can limit government and restrain it from abusing its power. First, constitutions can establish a supremacy of law, in which leaders can make no law but what they themselves and their posterity must be subject to. Second, constitutions can create separate branches of government. These branches' envy, fear, or interests are apt to make them spies and checks upon one another. Third, constitutions may check corruption through frequent election cycles, giving no sufficient time for officials to become corrupt. Vattel agreed that constitutions limit government. However, he noted that a constitution is a vain phantom, and the best laws are useless if they be not religiously observed. If a constitution is not accompanied by a strong rule of law, it is no more than a parchment barrier.
In a republic which derives all its power from the people, the limitations placed on the government equally limit the people and don't necessarily breed tension. For example, in Article 1, Section 8 enumerates Congress's limited powers. It equally limits what the people can seek from their representatives. Limits on government also protect individual liberties. The Bill of Rights bars the government from infringing on many rights, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and right to trial by jury. Article 1, Section 9 prevents Congress from passing certain legislation, such as ex post facto laws, bills of attainder, and the due process clauses of the 5th and 14th Amendment prevent government from arbitrarily depriving a citizen of life, liberty, or property.
As James Madison stated, where government power can be safely lodged, it is imprudent and unsafe to withhold it. We believe that the appropriate balance between limited and empowered government is a government with enough power to protect the people, but which can still be held accountable for its actions. It must be able to legislate to protect American society, such as the 2018 Support Act, a bipartisan law targeting the ongoing opioid epidemic. To ensure the government uses its powers responsibly, there must be checks and balances to limit it. It must be barred by an independent judiciary from infringing on enumerated rights and be held accountable by government officials and the citizens themselves.
In reality, beliefs on the appropriate balance between limited and empowered government is a matter of topic. People on both sides of the political spectrum are inconsistent. Conservatives want to empower the government with abortion limits, school curriculum mandates, and prohibitions on gender-affirming healthcare for minors, but want limited government when it comes to business, tax, and gun legislation. Liberals want to empower the government to create environmental, gun, and financial regulations, but want limited government when it comes to abortion rights, marijuana regulations, and police enforcement. The debate between empowered and limited government started with the dawn of political philosophy. It will continue long after today, and there is no perfect balance. But this debate is the heart of democracy. Thank you. We're now ready for your questions.
Excellent. Statements. Yeah, the issue of limited government, tyrants, trying to prevent against that. I'd like to hear your ideas on what do we have in our Constitution as governmental structures that ensure the peaceful transition of power to the political opposition.
I think fundamentally part of the peaceful transition of power to political opposition is not necessarily in the structure of our Constitution, but rather the norms surrounding the peaceful transfer of power. We saw this being introduced in the 1800 election, where power was given from the John Adams to Thomas Jefferson, who was of a different party than the Federalists.
And this democratic norm of peacefully transferring power from one president to another was recently disturbed by former President Donald Trump's refusal to concede the election and citing the insurrection.
And it is ultimately these democratic norms which we've built up over a long time that are ultimately guardrails for democracy. Stephen Levitsky writes in his book, How Democracies Die, that during the Trump administration we saw a strong erosion of democratic norms. In addition to the ones my colleagues mentioned, we also saw an erosion of mutual tolerance and forbearance, the idea that you must treat your political opposition as being legitimate enemies, not attack them personally, and degrade their position as your legitimate political opponents.
I want to go back and think about Trenchard for a little bit. You give us an introduction to the things that he did. What are his philosophical assumptions? And philosophical background? Who is he learning from? Who did he read to get him to that point?
So we can see John Trenchard primarily arising out of sort of the Lockean tradition. In the question itself, it does mention the state of nature, so we can see a strong influence of John Locke. Particularly drawing on John Locke, the idea that men actually have fundamental power within a state of nature, and that by extension you could determine, using the power each man has in a state of nature, you can determine the proper balance and limits on government. For example, no man can be ordered to do harm unto himself, which is an idea we draw from Locke, and it appears within the 60th Cato's letter, which is what the quote is taken from.
One thing that Trenchard and Gordon were really writing about was they saw moral degradation happening within English society at the time. They were really worried about the absolutism of the time period, especially with the Stuart monarchs. So they were really trying to write to emphasize the Republican virtue that they saw as the basis of society.
Both Trenchard and Gordon took influence from the classical Republicans and the natural rights theorists, and used it to write about the right ways that a government should govern, and the role of citizens and the role of the government and the leaders. And these were really influential in the founders when they were ratifying and writing the Constitution.
And probably one of the biggest influences for Trenchard and Gordon from Locke was the social contract theory, and the idea that men do create governments, and by creating governments, there are certain natural rights that the government cannot infringe on.
We can see these influences within our First Amendment, which protects the freedom of speech, which Trenchard and Gordon found fundamental. In addition to this, it prevents against establishment of religion and protects free exercise of religion, which were very important to the radical Whig tradition, which Trenchard and Gordon were part of.
Thank you.
So you mentioned in your prepared statement, one of those three requirements was to check corruption through frequent elections. We definitely have scheduled elections in modern American government, but we also have an incumbency rate of like 90%. So are they actually a check on the potential corruption of elected officials?
There's been concerns recently that the likelihood for incumbents to come back into office is just a little bit too much. People see the word incumbent on a ballot and they just check it because they've been there for so long and they just trust they're doing the right thing. And this is definitely a threat. If people are just being voted in because they were there before, are they really being voted in for the people, or they're being voted in just for no reason at all. And this, however, elections do serve as a check, because if the incumbent does something bad during office, they can be voted out. They still have people that are running against them.
And I think a great example of the incumbency going to work for checking politicians is the recent election of Congressman George Santos, and now the Republican Party not donating funds that they usually would for a congressman running in such a competitive district.
I think one of the solutions that we could have to this problem is an emphasis on civics education in our home state of Oregon. There was recently Senate Bill 513, which ensured civics education for all high school students.
And I don't think that term limits would be a solution to this problem. As we've seen in the North Carolina legislature, there's one state legislature who is on their last term now and has switched parties against the wishes of many of her constituents. Ultimately, this undermines the ability of her constituents to have their voices heard.
Additionally, there's no power under the Constitution to actually impose to limit the number of terms that Congress people can serve. In the case United States term limits v. Thornton, the state of Arkansas tried to impose these term limits, but it was ultimately struck down. And in Justice Kennedy's concurrence to that case, he emphasized the fact that the Constitution provides a fundamental right to vote and to serve in office when elected, and that the states cannot attempt to abridge this power granted under the Constitution.
I'd like to hear your ideas on, we're talking about limited government. What do we have that prevents the centralization of power? Preventions.
So fundamentally, I think one of the big things is we have a system of separated and shared powers, as I've discussed heavily in Federalist 51. So to give an example, the power of making treaties is a power that is shared between the President and the Senate, and the actual process of making treaties is dependent on the agreement and working together of those two branches of government. And that prevents against the consolidation of that particular aspect of government within one body.
Additionally, the federal system, as discussed in Federalist 51, works well to help maintain the levels of power within the government. The two republics on top of each other kind of help to ensure that rights are protected and government does not go too far.
Additionally, judicial review, established in the case Marbury v. Madison, is important in restraining the Congress from disregarding the Constitution and the clear unilateral governments that we have given the government as.
Many of the norms we've been discussing were decided by people 200 years ago and more. People dead for a very long time. Should the dead govern the living? Are we bound by their decisions, their norms, and their expectations?
We are by no means bound by anything of the founders. We, as the people, have the right to change the Constitution at any time through the amendment process. But there are important lessons to learn from these founders. They created one of the first, most revolutionary documents and governments of all time. And we are continuing their experiment, and we're looking back to the past to see what they said and to implement it to today and interpret it for today's standards.
I do, however, feel that the amendment process has actually become too difficult to get amendments passed, and this is by no means a modern concern. Patrick Henry, in a speech he gave to the Virginia Ratifying Convention, pointed out that only a 60th of the population could actually block an amendment from getting passed. So our ability to sort of give unilateral orders to the government through the amendment process, I think, is too far limited as it exists today.
And we now see with the beginning disregard of norms in the Supreme Court specifically, with the disregard for things such as stare decisis, which is a very important aspect of rule of law, and without having the amendment process to check this and reinforce these norms that are very important for the functioning of our government, there's a major threat to people's rights.
Thank you.
So if a member of the social contract feels that rights are being violated or government is overstepping, but due to age, incarceration, or citizenship status, they're not able to vote to voice that dissent, how else could they make their lack of consent to be governed currently known?
Civil disobedience is one of the fundamental ways that people, especially those who cannot vote, can get their voice heard. he says, direct action seeks to create such a crisis that a community is forced to confront the issue. By protesting, by being out in the streets, by disobeying unjust laws and accepting the punishments for doing so, you are raising awareness, you are sending a message to your government, and fundamentally that does raise communication, and ultimately should bring about new laws.
They can also petition. We saw this tradition of the right to petition all the way back to the English petition, the Petition of Rights, which is one of the fundamental English constitutional documents, and the right to petition is protected, again, under the First Amendment.
Additionally, they can start a legislative campaign. There are very little, limitations on who can do that, and by joining interest groups and other things, they can still have their voices heard, and legislators can still listen to them without having to be limited in it.
Okay, let's move to the speed round. We have about 45 seconds left. Has the United States government become too powerful or too weak? What do you say?
I think it depends on the branch that we're talking about. I think Congress is currently essentially non-functional because of its gridlock. The filibuster has gone too far in being able to give voice to sort of minority tyranny that we're now seeing in the Senate.
However, when it comes to executive orders have doubled in the past 20 years and the 8 years before that, which proves that executive power is growing by the minute, and that is something that people are very concerned about.
I also think there's a lack of accountability within the Supreme Court specifically. The Supreme Court is the one court in the entire United States that does not exist under a codified written code of ethics to which they have to apply. So there's a lack of accountability. We see this reflected most recently within the actions of Clarence Thomas in the Supreme Court not disclosing certain financial matters to the public.
Great question.
Well, that was really super, a great dialogue back and forth, and just love it. You talk about the innovative nature of our government constitution. It's a continuing experiment, and it really relies on us being aware and knowledgeable about what we're doing and where we've come from, and what to do next. And you really, really represent that.
I was impressed by your answer in response to the last the speed round question, because you get an enormous amount in about 45 I thought we were going to get everybody in there, so that was quite impressive. I'm glad to hear about stare decisis. That is really important, and because it's hard to pronounce, quite often gets left out. You gave us lots and lots and lots of details to support the general argument you were making. So very, very nicely done. Thank you.
So you clearly know your content, are conversant in it, and can hold complex and nuanced opinions on it. What I was particularly impressed by was your precision of language, that it's not only a separation of powers, but a sharing of powers. It's a little semantic change, but it can have significant implications in the connotations and the day-to-day functioning of that government that's created. So that attention to detail was carried throughout all of your opinions expressed, and thank you very much for a great conversation.
Thank you.